Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Ravi Chandra. Welcoming our three speakers for the day. We have Professor Amita Dhanda from Nalsar, Hyderabad, a professor of law. We have Sudhir Krishnaswamy, who's the Vice Chancellor of NLS in Bangalore. We have Mr. Dasgupta, who is former Secretary, Education and Rural Development, Government of India. He was also the former director of the Bangalore International Center and continues to mentor us at the BIC. I would now request Mr. Dasgupta to provide context and introduce the session, as well as give us a sense of Mr. B.N. Yugandhar, whom you knew quite well. Mr. Dasgupta, please.
Yeah. I'm delighted at the kind gesture of Bangalore International Center in agreeing to host the Yugandhar's Memorial Colloquium. And so I must begin first by thanking Mr. V. Ravichandar, who is not only the honorary director of BIC, but is also kindly hosting and coordinating this entire program. And I'll be missing in my duties if I don't mention also his teammates, Raghu and Lekha, who are providing the backup support from behind. And well, Professor Amita Dhanda and Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, whom Ravi has just now briefly introduced, they have been most gracious. They have been almost immediate in their response to agree to join this colloquium and also give us their own insight over this whole issue. Now let us look at the relevance of this subject. Don't you all agree that in the present scenario, when the talks about marginalized are increasingly getting focus, not only in the media channels, but also everywhere else where thinking people are talking about it, and it would have pleased late Yugandhar enormously had he been present in this seminar and fully participated in the discussion, which I'm sure he would have done. But then let us see, who is this Yugandhar of whom we are talking about? Now, B.N. Yugandhar, who was better known as Yugi to his contemporaries, colleagues, and some close associates, was born on 22nd October 1937 in an average middle-class family. He did his BA honors and MA in economics from Sri Venkateshwara University, Tirupati. Incidentally, he got first class in both, and later on went on to teach economics in the same university from June 1959 to May 1962, when he joined the IAS. I've often wondered, why did Yugi join the IAS at all? You know, he had the typical idealistic vision and passion of a teacher who ignite the latent sparks in the impressionable minds of every youth he came in contact with. Much later in his career, he, with his somewhat disheveled look, restless energy, and deeply penetrative eyes, looked every inch an absent-minded professor. This, I reason out, is probably the reason for Yugi opting for a much larger horizon in the IAS, where he could influence and strategize about the essence of micro-planning, about the socio-economic malaise which afflict the marginalized sections of the society, much more than any other sections of the society, not that they are unimportant. Several of my contemporaries and many of those officers who were his colleagues or juniors in the service during his stints in undivided Andhra Pradesh, or later on in the government of India, would testify that he largely succeeded in his missions. So would the young IAS probationers, whom he trained and tended with loving care during his two memorable stints, first as his deputy director and then later on as the director of Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration in Mussoorie, which in his time indeed became a center of excellence. Yogi, I must tell you, imbued every assignment he held, either in the junior or senior post, with the deep insight he had by his education, training, and voracious reading. Even as a very young subdivisional magistrate or district magistrate in the very troublesome Srikakulam district in the undivided Andhra Pradesh, Yogi always dealt with the issues with his own understanding and insight about what lies at the root of any problem. Now, all of you would know that Srikakulam was a Naxalite infested area, and Yogi realized that apart from the other issues, the problem of Naxalism could not be tackled by law and order approach alone. So he thought of innovative approaches in integrated tribal development projects in scheduled areas, and those which were aimed at those who were marginalized, landless, and who were generally at the bottom end of the society. I'm told, and of course this is anecdotal, that many of the Naxalite leaders admired him for his total selfless dedication and commitment to this whole process which he brought in. It's not my claim at all that B.N. Yugandhar was the only messiah who worked in these areas. There were several others. I can recall immediately two, like Mr. S.R. Sankaran, Mr. D. Bandyopadhyay, and many others who pushed the frontiers, notably in the land reforms area, and worked equally fearlessly with total dedication and ruffling several influential feathers, some of them official, in this whole process. Now, many of them, in their beliefs, in their approaches, were quite iconoclastic. They may not have looked so, but they were quite iconoclastics. And it's now a matter of record that they have become icons themselves to all those who came into contact with him. It's important to, it is not really important to recite the various assignments held by Yogi in his career, but people will recall with great admiration and fondness the stints he had in the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Institute for Administration, Planning Commission, and in the Prime Minister's office. I must mention in this context, and I'm sure Professor Amita Dhanda will support me, that in the Prime Minister's office, he, along with several others, really drew up, developed, and fine-tuned a blueprint for equal opportunities for the participation of specially abled persons in the mainstream social and economic activities. He breathed his last on 18th September last year and left behind a lasting legacy. I'm sorry, I must have overshot my time or my brief, and I very sincerely apologize to all of you. And may I now request Professor Amita Dhanda to join in at the stage and carry forward the colloquium. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mr. Dasgupta. And I think you shouldn't at all apologize for telling us so much about Mr. Yugandhar, because whilst I had the pleasure of meeting him and interacting with him, because he was so closely connected with rights for persons with disabilities, it is like he has been an iconic figure and somebody you very closely associate with, having worked for the excluded, the marginalized. And I think that's what's dictated the theme of this colloquium. I'm really thankful to BIC for getting me on board and giving me this opportunity of reflecting with you on this issue. As the poll, I think, with which we started the proceedings today has very strongly said that they don't really agree that the judiciary has done a great job there. So what I am planning to do in my presentation, I'm not sort of focusing attention on just the judiciary, but because this is a colloquium which has been organized and to honor the work that Mr. Yugandhar had done, it's kind of, and he was like, I think all his life invested with the socially economically disadvantaged and what is it that needs to be done for them. So what I plan to do this evening with you is to sort of like imagine that what is the kind of an institutional regime that we require if we are to have basic rights for all. I'm not saying we should not look at the role of the judiciary, but I really feel that in the wake of such a lot of disagreement on what the judiciary is, the contribution that the judiciary is making here, it might be worthwhile for us to expand our concerns and to look at the judiciary, but also look at who else can be significant players. Because at the end of the day, I think what we all want is that the concerns of the excluded and marginalized should get addressed. That's what what all of us are invested in, and that's I think the purpose of this particular colloquium this evening. So taking that on board, I would sort of like proceed from there to say, okay, when we speak in terms of, it's true, you know, like an individual like Mr. Yugandhar and the sort of legacy he's left would have its own inspirational quality. But all the time, we all recognize the fact that it's not just the individuals that we are. Those individuals can be doing what they can be doing if you have normative structures which protect them or which support them to do what they want, what they need to be doing. Now, one of those in this whole context is that we believe very often that the institutional regime of human rights is something that is constantly quoted as a way of ensuring that you have responsible governance. So human rights has been seen as vehicle to protect to provide protection to the defenseless. And as we all know, like the entire institution normative regime of human rights came in primarily because when after the wars, with states and governments having messed it up the way they did, you somewhere felt that you required some kind of a guarantee, some way of ensuring that power is exercised in a responsible kind of manner. And especially there is a kind of, you could say, a morality of the depths. There is some level beyond which people are not allowed to sink. Now, the protection provided by human rights to the defenseless to some extent got compromised by the fact that we went in for this division between social economic rights and civil political rights. And you were saying that, all right, civil political rights is something that you will immediately get. Social economic rights is something that will be progressively realized, subject to the resources that you have and all of that. And necessarily, you brought in justiciability for civil political rights. You did not bring it in for social economic. something which has changed over a period of time, but that's not the focus of my attention or my talk this evening. I am much more concerned with that, all right, if this is a vehicle and this division was not a very satisfactory or a happy one, then there's a gentleman called Henry Shue who somewhere tried to work out a way out of this, this dichotomy that was introduced, this division that was introduced, and he brought in something what he called as the idea of basic rights. And he said basic rights are those rights which have to be given to everybody if any of the other rights have to be realized. So basic rights was something like a foundation. And in his setting up of that foundation, he brought in two rights, the right to subsistence and the right to security, as something which has to be guaranteed to all. He said a right is only a right if you have made all the social arrangements for its actual realization and ensure that you can guard it, protect it against standard threats. I really would want to draw attention to the fact that he was saying that just assertion of a right, just the declaration of something as a right did not make it a right. What makes it a right is if whatever you say it is a right to, that actual substance is guaranteed to people. Now, this guaranteeing is something which is very critical in relation to how you are to be looking at the whole idea of basic rights. And I am mooting this idea of basic rights primarily because we are somewhere in today's evening's talk concerned with issues of social equity and the marginalized in India. Now, if we recognize or accept, a large part of my presentation is to some extent drawing from the theorizing that Henry Shue has put in. So if we recognize that this idea of basic rights that he has got, that everybody must be given subsistence and security, this is a bare minimum everybody must have, only if you have this. By security, of course, he meant that your own safety, you're not attacked, you're not physically in any which way violated. And by subsistence, he meant the basic needs of, like food, shelter, this, and evidently those subsistence needs would change, alter from society to society, exactly what is your level of economic development. But it meant that whatever is that level, there is one basic minimum that you guarantee to all. Now, if we take that into account, if we accept this particular point that Shue is making, and along with he's saying is a right is only a right if the substance of it is actually guaranteed. He's also sort of putting forth this idea that this division that you make between civil political as negative positive is all nonsense. What you really need to look at is how are you going to guarantee these rights? What duties are you placing on people? Who is going to ensure that these rights are guaranteed? And this is what gets me to the focus area or the question that we have for this evening's colloquium. Shue says that what you need to be doing is, in order to ensure that rights are guaranteed, you need three kinds of duties to be placed on people. He puts in a duty of avoidance, that means you don't take away from me what I already have. A duty of protection, which means you design your institutions in a manner that they are at all the time advancing these rights, and of course the duty of aid. I am not concerned this evening with either the avoidance duty or with the aid duty. I really want to focus my attention on the duty of protection. That if we are saying that these basic rights have to be guaranteed, and it also connects up with the question of what is the role of the judiciary. Because basic rights would be a means of ensuring social equity to the marginalized, then how is it that we are going to guarantee or ensure that these rights are in fact provided to people? That's the focus of my talk and what I would want to deliberate on. Now, usually one would say that if you have a right and you have provided for judicial review, then to that extent, you are, what you are doing is that you have provided for a mechanism by which that which was guaranteed to you as a right as in fact can be realized. When Ambedkar spoke about when Article 32 came and he said that it's the most important article or it's the heart of the Constitution, the idea somewhere was that if you've been guaranteed a right and anybody is denying it to you and you can go to court and you can realize it, that sort of is a, it settles up things for you. And to a large extent today also, when we are having this talk and we're talking about the role of the judiciary, we are carrying on with that same presumption. I am putting forth to you, and that's the way in which my presentation, I'm putting forth to you that maybe along with the courts, I feel that if we are to look at this institutional mechanism by which we can provide protection, I would put forth to you three. I would say, let's look at courts, that is the judiciary. Let's look at multi-sectoral agencies other than the judiciary as a mechanism by which we would be guaranteeing rights to people. We'd be protecting their rights. And the third I'm saying is, let's look at the permanent executive. Let's look at the civil servants. Let's look at, and I suppose to some extent, the reason why I am wanting to sort of focus attention or bring to the foreground this whole question of the permanent executive is also because this particular talk is happening in memory of Mr. Yugandhar. I think it's important that somewhere when we do memorial lectures, they should have a very integral kind of a connection with the person in whose memory we are doing what we are doing. So when I come to courts and I need to be looking at what is it that, see, I understand the poll and I understand why we would have the sort of dissatisfaction that is being voiced in the poll. I'm not sort of laboring that point, because you also have the kind of, you could say, the honeymoon periods with the court. You've had periods wherein all of us felt, by God, if it hadn't been for the courts, what would we have done? So we keep that aside, and I would just want to raise it much more as a conceptual question. That we, though we continually applaud the existence of judicial review, and I would not at all want to in any which way say it is not important. And you also believe it protects our rights, but one has to accept the fact that the judiciary or the courts are primarily reactive institutions. They are institutions who will act if you go to them. If you tell them, this is my problem, can you do something about it, this or that way? And this particular right of mine guaranteed by the Constitution or by a legislation or whatever it has in some manner, so could you do something? Now, if you don't do that, and that's where the birth of judicial activism comes in, courts as an institution is not really geared to proactively come to your aid. We had in more recent times, like we worked on this business of that, where you speak about the judiciary taking a more activist stance, where you allow people to, not the people who are aggrieved, but other people to come to the court, or the court suo motu itself acts. But let's recognize the fact that both of these are not the rule. They are the exceptions. As an institution, it is primarily an institution which acts when somebody comes to them. That's one thing. And it's extremely important, because if their default mode is made in that manner, you're always meaning that you require people who are going to change the default mode for them to be doing things differently. That's one thing which is important for all of us to appreciate. The second point I want to also make, which is equally important, which also means that if you don't have the wherewithal, if you do not have the money power, if you don't have the educational power, if you don't have the social capital, you are not really very well suited to be able to go before courts. It also means is that if somebody else does it for you, then it still happens according to how that somebody else thinks about the matter, not exactly according to how you see the issue. And because a judiciary as such functions as an authoritarian institution, it's an institution which adjudication as such is a zero-sum game. You're right or you're wrong. I'll give it to you or I'll not give it to you. They have occasionally tried to bring in dialogue, But the dialogue is also something which is not between two players who are on a level playing field. It is between, like the Raja and the Praja kind of dialogue. So you are asking questions, but your answer has to be more or less in the frame in which I want it. So I would somewhere say, and this is what I'd put to you, I'll come back to this at the very end of my presentation, but I just want to put it to you that because it's authoritarian and it's not dialogic, and the fact that judiciary as such is a reactive and not an activist institution, it can provide oversight to other players, but may not really be the prime mover for protecting the interests of the marginalized. To go to my second option, I was saying, let's look at multi-sector agencies. Now, what comes in with the multi-sectoral agency, and the reason why I'm sort of putting it forth, is wherein I would believe that the way in which we constitute it, we don't make it only a statist kind of an institution. We have some kind of a combination of civil society and people, and we try to say that, all right, let us, because this is an aspect of our polity which requires more attention. Let's not make it or leave it only with state agencies. Let's try to make it some kind of a cooperation between the people and administrators, and try to bring in that kind of an agency into play. I'm not saying it exists, it's just a sort of an idea I'm floating to you, because it has its attraction. Some of us, especially with some of the things that all of us have felt good about in relation to, say, the right to information. The right to information somewhere got the people involved in the whole process of governance. So, but what is to be understood and appreciated, it's still an external agency. It's only going to ensure that tasks are performed. It's not, in fact, going to do them itself. So it's whether they can really ensure that the substance of the right that is to be guaranteed will in fact be realized. They are still dependent on someone else. They are not the ones who can do it. That brings me to the permanent executive. That is the third player whom I feel we should be looking at as we are wanting to imagine what we need to do in relation to institutions. And I am somewhere asking us to revisit the role of the civil servant. And I'm saying that, see, somewhere, especially all of us have stories of that the performance of public service for the civil service or for the permanent executive is both form and substance. It is something that they are meant to be doing. That is their primary role. That's why they're coming into. So I am somewhere feeling is this, that instead of us all of the time kind of engaging with this question of whether the court is doing its job or not, let's try to look at people who are meant as, who have been geared, whose involvement has been designed as an involvement to actually address the concerns of the marginalized. I'm also somewhere saying is, in law, we have this point where we say that you can look at the whole question of administrative accountability from a red light model or a green light model. The logic of the red light, green light is, and we are in India, we follow a red light model. The red light model is that if the administration is doing whatever it's doing and is doing well, that's one part of point. But if you have a grievance, then you stop it from doing whatever it is doing and you sort of take the matter to court, and that's wherein the whole business of judicial review comes in, and courts become then institutions by which they are ensuring that the administrator is performing his role or not. The green light model, on the other hand, is also recognizing the fact of grievance, but it's not letting the grievance go external so much. It's trying to work out as strongly as it's possible to kind of build in this whole question of accountability within the functioning of the administration. So it becomes almost like a point of pride that if people have a difficulty or a grievance, we must find a way around it. They should not have to need to go to court. We should try to have this kind of a dialogue, work out what is needed, what can we do, what's the give and take that is possible. Because somewhere administration, unlike adjudication, has necessarily to be negotiated. It has to be dialoguing. Unfortunately, and I'm not onto that, it's the fact of that you can sometimes just be thinking in terms of only your power and authority and not about your service. But that's exactly what I feel we need to get back to and say that you try to create a culture of service. You take pride in ensuring that the duty is performed. We celebrate, I mean, like this colloquium is for me significant for that reason, that we are celebrating somebody's extraordinary performance and saying that, yes, if he could do it, it can be done. And if it can be done, then how do we replicate it? How is it that we can make it like it's more the norm? And that's the point from where I sort of, what I'm drawing attention to. And so the important thing when I'm saying that icons need to be celebrated, because I feel when we celebrate icons, we also create a culture. We create a culture by which we say that if you go into the civil services only if you want to do public service. So only people who want to do public service should get into the civil services. If you are somebody who's only, like self-driven, who wants to do things for himself or herself, then maybe this is not the career for you. And that's the kind of thing that it should not be like, my God, if you become the collector or if you are the IS officer, you're God. If that is the way in which we present, then evidently there's a problem. But I think we have icons like Mr. Yugandhar, we have S.R. Shankaran, we have B.D. Sharma, we have a whole range of, if you start collecting stories, you would find any number of people who've really, really put a lot into. And these stories of honesty, courage, they need to be told and retold, because these are the people who are actually required to do things for that marginalized and excluded. The marginalized and excluded haven't to come to them. They are meant to go there. Possibly we need to also rethink, and that would be like to look at the whole phenomena of public service in an independent country. Large parts of our models of public service or civil service are something that we inherited from our colonial past. What of that we need to weed out? What is it that we need to, how do we rework the whole status and stature and the functioning of the civil servant in an independent India? For me, that's an important piece of work that we need to do. And we need to see, I personally would move to you that we need to see the permanent executive as the primary protector of the rights of the marginalized. It is important that we go back to see, and if we accept that fact, then we need to be seeing, all right, what impedes them in doing what they are doing? How can we support the work that they are doing? Just as a preparation for this particular presentation, I did a random kind of a thing on, leading civil servants in the country. And I actually got 10 names just coming up, like you have somebody, in fact, somebody in the IPS who's in Karnataka, who's kind of believes in community-friendly policing, is a poet himself and has got several people in his police force to take to poetry. So when you speak in terms of that, yes, we need an empathetic police force, then how do you make an empathetic police force? What has somebody done which can be replicated? You have somebody who's Armstrong Pane in Manipur, who's kind of remembered for the fact that he created some 100 kilometers of road, by reason of which he made that entire different parts of the state accessible and the state connected to other northeastern states. You also have, of course, being told about someone who has had 9 transfers in 12 years. And that is being put out as an indicator of the kind of honesty and the sort of work that he's been doing. So evidently, we don't want people who are honest and who are doing good work to be transferred around the place. We don't want that kind of representation, whether it's in Bollywood or otherwise, that if you are honest and if you stand up, that's the end of you. I think as people, we need to be sort of starting to speak about how do we make for a public service, which is a public service. And what is it that we need to be doing to empower our public servants to be able to do that kind of task? I'm not romanticizing the whole thing. I'm not denying the fact that you will or you may have black sheep, but I don't think black sheep are unique to any one service. You're going to find them everywhere. The only point I want to sort of put to you as I'm closing this is that I am saying that it is important for us to start looking at institutional mechanisms which were designed and created to perform service, rather than to, in an extraordinary situation, something which the judiciary should be doing every time the other organs fail to do what they are meant to do. It should come as an oversight institution. It should also, if absolutely necessary, I am not against judicial activism, but I definitely do think that we need to theorize judicial activism. We need to think in terms of where is it that it shouldn't be that where we really want them to come in, they say, oh no, this is a matter of the executive. And where we don't want them to be really intervening because the executive is doing a decent job, we suddenly have an activist judiciary before our face. And I think it's important for us not to sort of think in these blocks, and instead to sort of like, unpack what is contained in each and try to work from there. The fact that they would be, I suppose I am wanting to close with this one point, that you may have abuse of power and you may have black sheep, but you can't do good by rendering people powerless. And the fact that some people may do ill is no reason to prevent other people from doing good. What we need to be investing in is that the rule for which we have the various institutions to function well, that and the dysfunctioning remains the exception, and that for which they are made, they are allowed to do, they are supported in doing. For me, that's the way in which I would want to imagine how we should be addressing questions of social equity and of the marginalized. Thank you so very much.
Professor Dhanda, that was absolutely brilliant. The way you expounded the multifaceted theme of today was absolutely brilliant. Had this colloquium been in the physical form in the BIC hall, you would have received a standing ovation. I have no doubt about it. So I do my namaskar to you as per the present tradition. And wish you the best of luck in your mission. I'm sure Nalsar University under you would certainly go to places, no doubt about it. Thank you very much for a very, very insightful talk. And may I now request Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, Vice Chancellor of National Law State University, Bangalore, to step in and carry forward the colloquium further.
Thank you. Good evening, everyone. And may I first thank Mr. Ravichandar and Dr. Dasgupta for inviting me to speak at the first BN Yugandhar Memorial Colloquium. The title for the colloquium is Social Equity and the Marginalized, the Role of the Judiciary. And one might expect, as you have two panelists who are legal academics, and this is in some sense bread and butter of the classroom, that we might go off on a exposition about these issues. And I think that Professor Dhanda has already advisedly begun with an account of BN Yugandhar and what his work might mean to the theme that we are addressing today. And I'm going to take a very similar tack. Unlike the other panelists, Dr. Dasgupta or Professor Dhanda, I didn't have the opportunity to meet Mr. BN Yugandhar. And so my assessment and my analytical overview of his career is influenced not by personal experience, but from what I can make of what we have, written records of his work, his own and those of others. So the way I would begin is by trying to locate his and describe his career as being spread across 3 phases. As Dr. Dasgupta described, he began as an IS officer in 1962 in Naxalite-prone districts of Andhra Pradesh. And it appears that in his early years, and I'll just call this the first phase, he was particularly interested in the question of land and tenancy reform and land reform implementation in particular. There are reports on the web that he helped secure tenancy rights for almost 30,000 acres. I have no capacity to verify any of this, and this is not academic work. But what is interesting is that his own assessment of the effect of land reform in Andhra Pradesh was that it was far from effective. And if anything, it had failed to upset the power relations in Andhra Pradesh, in rural Andhra Pradesh where he worked. That never stopped him, and as Professor Dhanda advised us, that sometimes the futility of what we try to do should not dissuade us from doing it nevertheless. But you see one striking element to Mr. Yugandhar's approach to these questions. He very quickly puts together some professional/academic writing on the question of land and land reform, four-volume series which assesses the implementation of land reform across India, including in Andhra Pradesh. And this is published by Sage Publications. I want to make this point not so much to emphasize the simple fact that he has published a book, but that he seems to have constantly seen the connection between the work that he might do on an everyday basis, as well as its wider intellectual implications. There is a fair account that he put in the same kind of effort in institutionalizing the teaching of land revenue law in the Mussoorie Academy for IAS officers. And accounts of his role there suggest that he made young probationers think that revenue law was one of the most important parts, land revenue law was one of the most important and glorious parts about being an IAS officer. It's usually seen as the part of a land law that most law students would want to avoid assiduously. But the sense you get from that early phase is that Mr. Yugandhar understands the relationship between an understanding of land politics in his practice as an IAS officer, as well as his academic and intellectual development of these interests, both in print and in the Mussoorie Academy. The second phase of his career, it appears, seems to be the higher levels of the Secretariat in undivided Andhra Pradesh with the then Chief Minister, N.T. Ramarao. For all of us who know that Mr. Ramarao came to office with a strong majority, an overwhelming majority, one might say, and he chose Mr. Yugandhar as a key member of his bureaucratic team, which sought to implement a 2 rupees a kg rice scheme. And you might remember that this was often portrayed in analytical writing on politics in that period as not only a vote winner, but as something that transformed the politics of South India, because that scheme catches the imagination of other South Indian states and then all across India, and becomes one of the main planks of welfare delivery in India. Yeah, and oftentimes we see schemes like these as freebies and giveaways, but that doesn't seem to have bothered Mr. Yugandhar too much, because in a book titled Studies in Rural India, which he published much later, he makes an argument why interventions in development in rural India need to figure out how we fix the plumbing of welfare delivery. And he seems to have key insights there, which is, let's go with universality. Let's go with some key welfare deliverables that are essential for life and well-being, and use those two to drive a welfare program in a state government. And once again, I want to emphasize in this second phase, this ability to move to be both an actor within government designing and delivering programs, as well as the ability to think about these programs and write about them in a wider intellectual frame. It appears at this period that he worked with Mistahak Sir and others around questions of minimum wages, around questions of bonded labor and debt relief for the rural poor, all of which he thought were essential for the Indian welfare state to deliver. The third phase of his career, in my telling, was at a much later stage, where he might be understood to be something of an institution builder, someone interested not just in the everyday grammar of governance, but thinking more broadly about how the Indian state is set up and how it is administered. The first role he plays here is as the director of the Lal Bahadur Shastri National Academy of Administration from 1988 to 1993. In this period, as I mentioned earlier, not only was he seen to be someone who deeply influenced and mentored generations of IAS officers, but also 10 years later, 10 years after his retirement, he writes a report, the Yugandhar Committee report on in-service training for IAS officers, which was published in 2003. He's a part of a team, so I don't know enough to say where authorship and where these ideas might have come from. But what I'm struck by and what I want to emphasize is that an officer who worked on land reform in the early part of his career and welfare delivery in the second part of his career writes a report that is strikingly non-ideological. One of the recommendations of this report is that the IAS needs to embrace new public management. It needs to embrace public-private partnerships. It needs to think about engaging with strong East Asian democracies that have not only successfully reformed markets, but have improved welfare delivery remarkably in 3 decades. What I'm struck by in the tone of the report is that, at least for Mr. B.N. Yugandhar, the ideological trap that one is either interested in the development and the regulation of markets, that if you're interested in that, then you're a neoliberal, and then no one needs to really talk to you because you're not interested in welfare for the poor. It doesn't seem to hold water, at least in his case. He's quite comfortable being a strong advocate of welfare programs, while simultaneously asking the IAS through the academy to tone up and embrace for the fact that the world has changed and the IAS needs to change with it. In the same phase, this third phase of his career, he was appointed as the special secretary to the Prime Minister P.V. Narasimha Rao. And whatever else we know about that period, we know that it was a period of dramatic economic reform in India. It was also a period of quite substantive social welfare reform. At least in one version of Indian history of that period, it seems that we only emphasize 1991 as a neoliberal turn. We failed to account for the fact that the most massive expansions in welfare expenditure in the history of independent India occurred in the same period. And B.N. Yugandhar and others, I'm sure, had no small role to play in that process. While he was with the Prime Minister, it appears that one key initiative that is credited to his name is this effort to push the central government to directly engage with local government agencies, bypassing state governments. It appears that Mr. Yugandhar and I suppose a few others had concluded that state governments were unlikely to ever devolve functions or resources directly to local government, and that the central government could indeed improve educational outcomes if it directly transferred resources to these local agencies. And the Watershed Developments Program, it seems, is the vehicle for this idea. As many of you are aware, this has become a model in various other programs and one that has seen some success. The third phase, the third element of this third phase of his career appears to be the period 2004 to 2009, UPA 1, when he was appointed as a member of the Planning Commission. This is the phase that I might have been, while the others on this panel have met him personally, during this phase, I happened to be 2 rooms away from him in the Planning Commission, working, burrowed away in a small room, working on questions. I might have been seen by some at least to be on the other side, working on questions of regulation, some elements of airport privatization and port regulation and so on, infrastructure questions, not really the welfare questions. And I did see him occasionally in that phase, but neither had the courage nor the confidence to drop in to see him or to engage him more directly. What is striking about this period in the UPA, one is once again, you see Mr. Yugandhar publishing a book on decentralized planning, and which makes a strong argument for direct transfers from the center to local governments as a key plank for development reform. So let me summarize. My sense of Mr. Yugandhar's career and his efforts as a bureaucrat are that and I'll make 3 points in summary. First, that he was undoubtedly passionate about responding, that public service was a response to the needs of the rural poor, and that he must, in his work, respond directly and strongly to this need. Second, that the work that one does on the ground is not in some ways inimical to the kinds of intellectual thinking and theorizing that is necessary for us to understand our contemporary worlds. And third, it seems that for him, the ideologically blinkered view that one might have, is so commonplace in our main broadcast media and elsewhere in our intellectual culture, that one must either be concerned with issues of welfare or with issues of economic reform. It seems that these kinds of issues didn't detain him for too long, and that provides a certain perspective and richness to his career. So let me move to part 2 of my talk. Now, what does all of this have to do with social equity for the marginalized and the role of the courts? What was striking is that unlike many other contemporaries, like people who have been referred to earlier, other bureaucrats, Mr. Shankaran, Mr. Pandey, and others, who engaged the courts quite rigorously, I did a very quick search of the legal databases to see if Mr. Yugandhar saw it fit to be a party in the court system and file PILs or engage with PILs in some way. And I was struck that unlike the peers and contemporaries he's often compared with, there doesn't appear to be a record of his engagement with the courts. So I'm going to say something about the courts and circle back to what I think Mr. Yugandhar's career can teach us. What I say about the courts will draw quite heavily on a book that I co-edited, which was published last year by the Cambridge University Press, which is called A Qualified Hope. Professor Dhanda already mentioned that we had a euphoric few decades thinking that the court was, at least since the 1980s, at least for 3 decades, there was a view that the courts were some kind of voice amplifier of the poor, and that they would come down and change the social worlds that we were confronted with. And I think that kind of euphoria has, for the most part, paled away. And the poll at the start of this session confirms that, at least for the audience today, they are not terribly optimistic or enthusiastic about the court's role on these questions. But so let me give a brief account of this euphoric role and then get to so what? What can we learn about what the courts can do, and where does Mr. B.M. Yugandhar fit into all this? So the first thing is that the euphoric accounts, and these are the mistakes we might well avoid, relied most of the time on hagiographic accounts of heroic lawyers and valiant judges. So these were accounts of why some socially concerned lawyers or judges could somehow use an institution and transform a society. They were the internal institutional accounts of progress. The unit of progress was usually doctrinal progress. You know, there was a heavy emphasis on doctrine. So let's say tomorrow the court says that you have a right to health, or you have a right to a free COVID-19 test. Now, this is important. It's important that courts say this, but it is what it is. It is a statement by an institution, in this case, the Supreme Court, advancing an account of the right to health to include a COVID-19 test. The court's declaration of such doctrine doesn't change the social world. So what we found in the early euphoric decades is that journalistic accounts of this doctrinal progress usually trumped up the court. The court is always on the front pages of the newspaper. There wasn't a careful enough assessment of what this doctrinal progress means for our wider society. So the book that I mentioned, A Qualified Hope, is the first systematic account of the impact of these decisions in changing this social world. Goes beyond court doctrine. So court saying something is useful, it's a useful starting point, but then we need to figure out what has the court done to change the world. Professor Dhanda has already cautioned us in her conclusion that it's a slight a feat of imagination to somehow imagine that the court has a magic wand, that the court will somehow wave that magic wand at complex social problems, and those problems will go away. And this kind of mythical view of court power should best be left by the wayside. And what we might want to do is to ask a slightly different question. Not can the courts usher in progressive social change on their own, but ask a slightly different question, which is, under what conditions can a court usher in a progressive social change? And that's the question we set out to do. And let's set up a panel of examples that we can test. Let's look at the court's decisions on sex determination. The court has had a strong role in declaring that any determination of the sex of the fetus by any form of testing is a violation of the law. There's been legislation to follow. How has it worked out? Has this reduced the sex determination of the fetus? We might ask, what has the court's role been on Delhi air pollution? As most of us know, by the mid-90s, the Supreme Court of India had become the Supreme Court of Delhi, in that it monitored Delhi air pollution on a regular basis, passed several orders. To what end? We might also ask a similar question about the right to food litigation. And the right to food litigation has run along for almost a decade and a half. It's not a single large order, it's several small orders, which seems to have galvanized a certain form of both civic and state action to make a difference on questions of food security. So if we look at a panel of decisions like this, and then we ask, what has changed? And under what conditions is it likely that progressive social change is possible? Two conditions appear to surface, at least in the context of this talk. The book has a further treatment of this question, but in the context of this talk, two conditions seem to be very important. The first is the presence of an empowered civil society. Why is the empowered civil society important? It's important, it appears, because civil society does two or three things. First, civil society mobilizes social groups to approach the court, to approach the state, but also to approach the court. So it has this mobilization role. Second, civil society seems to be an alternative funnel of information. Whenever you rely exclusively on state-fed information or on anecdotal accounts, and you don't have a civil society architecture that is generating new information, litigation seems to have very little hope of delivering any meaningful outcomes. Third, civil society it plays a crucial role in pushing the court. So we see that whenever there is litigation, which is very granular, for example, says this should be implemented, the midday meals scheme needs to be implemented in this manner in these 6 districts of Bihar, the chances of it being implemented are extremely high. Rather than when the court just makes a grand gesture, a grand pronouncement about the range or scope of rights that we have. So civil society has all of these effects. It becomes a funnel for information, it channelizes state action, it's a vector for social mobilization. The second factor that seems to determine when courts can have some meaningful role in social change is the presence or the absence of latent state capacity. Now, it's interesting that when we look at Delhi air pollution cases and we look at the rather dismal state of the pollution control boards and environmental bureaucracy generally, the capacity of this bureaucracy to respond to the court's hectoring, no matter how loud and how persistent, is extremely poor. The bureaucracy is underfunded, is under-institutionalized, and it's certainly under-motivated. In these conditions, the ability to get the bureaucracy to the state to deliver on the basis of litigation drops remarkably. However, when latent state capacity exists, it's reasonably well institutionalized and well funded, the response can be quite remarkable. And while I might say, I mean, not for a moment am I thinking that food security issues have been dealt with, but if you look at an order like the midday meal scheme order, and look at its implementation across India, it is one of the most remarkable feats of litigation-induced social change, which has almost a pan-India effect. So far, I've just tried to identify factors that can help us predict when litigation or engaging a court is likely to result in progressive social change and social equity for the marginalized. So let me just tie back and conclude by looking at what does Mr. B. N. Yugandhar have to do with this. I started the second part of my talk by making it clear that I found no evidence that he was passionate about the courts or felt the need to engage the courts on an ongoing basis. But what I'm struck by is a comment by his colleague in the then Planning Commission, Ms. Saeeda Hamid, who describes Mr. B. N. Yugandhar in this way, that he was an activist at heart and a bureaucrat by profession. I'll just repeat that, an activist by heart and a bureaucrat by profession. So it appears, and I find that description very useful because his work seems to bear this out. You know, I recall just hearing in the corridors of the Planning Commission at that point that Mr. Yugandhar was very clear-voiced and full-throated in his defense of social programs, no matter where these meetings occurred, whether it was in the Prime Minister's office, with the Prime Minister, or elsewhere. He was very clear about his views. His kind of, you know, eloquent, low profile was all very important, but in the corridors of power, he was very clear about stating what he thought was important and carrying through on those ideas. And my sense is that's what Ms. Hamid is trying to describe as being an activist temperament. And you would have noticed that the parts that I tried to highlight as being key vectors for court success are these two elements. If we find bureaucrats who are passionate about building state capacity for the delivery of social welfare, and simultaneously have the ability to be both insiders in the system, and Professor Dhanda mentioned this, you can't fight shy of power, you're there to shift power, right? So you need to participate in the structures of power, but at the same time, have the ability to be a relative outsider, to be an iconoclast, as Dr. Dasgupta put it, to have an activist mind, to see the need for other social forces to have these engagements with power. This kind of dual ability seems to be the key to get the courts to work. And so let me conclude like that. that the presence of bureaucrats like Mr. Yugandhar in the Indian state system gives it the porosity to make court-led social change possible and feasible. And it's, I suppose then, as others on this panel have done, an invitation for other bureaucrats and other public servants to adopt a similar posture. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Krishnaswamy. It was absolutely top class and incisive commentary on the relevance and about Yugandhar himself. You said you didn't know him personally, excepting for some fleeting glances 2 cubicles away. But the way you have analyzed Yugandhar, very few people would have done. And that comment by Professor Saida Hamid is very perceptive. Yes, it's very true. Perhaps his emphasis was less on the civil service pushing the whole burden rather than relying on the court. But well, I'm sure had he been alive, he would have been not only an activist at heart, and maybe some of the PILs would have had his signature also. Thank you very much, Professor Krishnaswamy. I think in between you and Professor Amita Dhanda, you have put the whole colloquium in the proper perspective. And now we have already started receiving questions, some of which you would have seen already, and some you would be able to see during the course of the discussion. I can quickly mention that two bullet points. For instance, there seems to be a feeling that the legal profession, which is trained by the Bar Council of India, is not able to perform its duties to the extent it should, because the legal education itself has become totally outdated, outmoded, with absolutely irrelevant curriculums, with emphasis more on regular classes and mandatory attendance. Now, this is a view passionately urged by the questioner. There is another one which says, well, police are not really doing their duties. They are saying that we are busy with lockdown and all these things, and we have really no time to look at all these social issues which the activists are posing. So what do? We are ourselves understaffed. We have several duties, including VIP duties. What do we do? And then another set of people seem to be feeling that, well, isn't the civil service itself become totally mediocre these days? And don't they have something of their own stake in maintaining status quo? Now, I'd be very interested in having your perspectives, Professor Krishnaswamy and Professor Dhanda, about what you feel about some of these issues they have raised. Over to you, whoever wants to take it.
Okay, I'll go first because I think Sudhir needs to get his breath back. Well, as far as the legal education question is concerned, I would suggest to BIC to hold another colloquium. I don't think we should talk about that in today's colloquium. It isn't something which will come on all fours here. And more importantly, there are questions which have come, which I think are addressing some of the concerns more directly, and I would prefer that we devoted our attention to that. I am not in any way denying the importance of the question that the concerned colleague is raising, but I think, and possibly it's coming because of the fact that you have 2 law professors on the panel, so he feels it's appropriate that we should be put on the spot. I think if we have more time, we would be able to do justice to your concerns, so I would just recommend it as a future agenda. And the whole question, I would sort of want to pick up the third question, because the whole issue of the police not finding time, you know, we're all like in this time, it's like the sort of way in which people are prioritizing could be problematic per se for everybody. And, you know, how much thinking we should have done in advance before we did this, that, or the other is something which I think we need to be all learning. That, all right, how do you learn to think on your feet? How do you sort of make your, you know, general way of operation such that you don't need extraordinary situations to be doing what you should ordinarily be doing? And that is a very different body of training. I mean, I think Sudhir must be also experiencing it, but I'm having any number of students horribly anxious because we have these super smart students in our respective schools who are just not knowing how to handle uncertainty. They want everything like, you know, like sort of really tied up and made pakka and certain. The fact that 70%, 80% of your country's population is living in that uncertainty on an everyday basis is something which doesn't strike them. Because you have a very defined way of living your life. So now suddenly when it's become uncertain, you don't know how to deal with it. And I think that's something I would just link up obliquely to the first question and say that that is something that all of us as educators, and I don't see educators as only people who carry that label of being professors, but I think education is done in several kinds of ways and modes. We really need to be asking whether the generation of now, that is whether we as parents have made much too soft children, and whether we were like made to be, you know, we were hardier or were trained to take hardship in life more on our chin. I mean, I'm just, it's a, you could say it's like an abstract kind of an answer, but I do feel that these sort of values questions need to be asked. We need to be asking, you know, okay, what makes for a good human being? Because you first need to be a good human being before you become a good, you know, before you become a good administrator or a good judge or a good professor, whichever. So I had, I wanted to just little bit speak on the mediocrity thing, and then maybe Sudhir can come in. I have also from the questions, one or two questions which I thought I would want to address, but the mediocrity thing has got also to do with the fact of, and I mean, if you connect it with the theme of today's talk, did the judiciary in some way taking over the tasks of the executive or trying to be sort of dictating things, did it in any way, some way sow the seed of that you started to not want to take responsibility? You felt whatever you may be doing, you're going to get hauled up. So let these chappies decide what they want to decide. I am not saying this is necessarily the case, but I do think it's a question worth asking. See, in typical administrative law, and when we talk about judicial review, the court is meant to only see that whether the administrator had applied mind, did what he was required to do on a relevant considerations, proper purpose, not like if the court was in the administrator's position, what would the court have done? And there is a logic for it. It is like basically the person who's on the ground, unless and until somebody has done something which is so pernicious, so offensive, that necessarily then it is something that should be reviewed and corrected. But if there are two ways of handling something and the administrator has taken one line, is the court is it in order for them to say that if I was there, I would do it differently and hence it should be done differently? That entire body of case law, which is large part of it is also common, which makes it, you know, like it almost encourages mediocrity, and it also somewhere demoralizes people. It's like if your boss every day overturns whatever you are proposing. There's a point after which you tell the boss, okay, I leave the files on your table, you might as well do what you want to.
Can I butt in a little bit?
Yeah, sure.
In this respect, I'll be the devil's advocate of the mediocrity. And I have heard many times people saying we are in the grip of 3 C's, the CBI or the CAG or the CVC. So Therefore, it is much better to leave the decisions aside and let the status quo continue. I've heard it saying. I didn't hear much in our days. Not that in our days we were all great saints, but I see it or hear it much more often these days. Any comments on that?
No, I mean, I'm saying, I said at the end of my lecture too, that I'm not saying there are not black sheep. And I'm not even saying that you don't need regulatory measures. But I also definitely think that if we operate from this basis of that everybody who's occupying a position of power is a blackguard, and we're out to get them, then necessarily you make people blackguards whether they are or not. Or they prefer to just stay and, like stay within conformity and say, I should not get into trouble, because otherwise this or the other will be kind of unleashed on me. And I think we really, really seriously need to be asking, you can't create excellence by not appreciating, not recognizing, and not giving the space for excellence. You have to allow dissent and disagreement in a society if you want excellence. If you want conformists, then you get mediocrity. And I think it's about time that we confronted that fact. And and I'm not talking only in relation with the permanent executive in the court. I'm saying it in any institution. The teacher or the professor or the student is the one who's not agreeing with you, who has another way of looking at things. If you don't like that disagreement, and if you want everybody to just mirror you back at you, then necessarily it's a recipe for mediocrity.
Absolutely. Couldn't agree with you. Professor Krishnaswamy would like to step in and give us your point of view.
Thank you, Dr. Dasgupta. So there seem to be many questions on the panel, and one of those questions is about whether Mr. Yugandhar and others of his type are exceptional cases, and whether newer generations of bureaucrats are somehow less so. And to that, my quick response is that I suppose, as Professor Dhanda has done, if one surveys contemporary bureaucrats, both young and old, we would find many enterprising and socially engaged bureaucrats across the generations. But the part that I would like to emphasize is not to kind of come up with a rank order, but to emphasize the disposition. The disposition of mediocrity is this unwillingness to challenge political power, or to unwillingness to challenge social power. That is, when one goes out and does work in the world and finds that social power is organized in particular ways, or political power is organized in particular ways, do we have both the values and the conviction to challenge the way it is organized? So I would rephrase the question. I mean, it's not a question of, are you excellent? I guess all of us are excellent in some ways and not so excellent in other ways. It's about, do we have the disposition? And in the context of the talk today, it seems that this ability to be able to have a conviction about your values and to challenge social power as one finds them, it seems to be the critical thing that distinguishes Mr. Yugandhar and others like him. And that is a disposition we want to encourage. Right? We want to encourage that in our students. We also want to encourage that in our bureaucrats. Because that makes for leadership, which is what the privileged position of being an IAS officer should be about. So I thought I'll respond to that one question. There seem to be a lot of questions about the court and how should the court have intervened in the COVID-19 crisis, and should it have said this or said that, and so on. And my quick response on that is that under conditions of what is effectively a national emergency, we should not, courts would do well not to direct the contours of state response. Courts would do well to protect citizens. And that's all, that's the limited role. If the courts were effective watchdogs over civil liberties, if courts were effective watchdogs over about the provisioning of basic needs, we don't need courts to do too much else. There is a particular question by Raki Anil about what what the Chief Justice may or may not have said, and I used an offhanded comment in my offhanded phrase rather in my talk, and I said, oh, it's journalistic hagiographies that we should be concerned about it, because it doesn't really matter what the Chief Justice may or may not have said. I'm not that interested. I'm really interested in what they do, the orders that they pass. The fact, I mean, this is not a a competition of virtue where everyone is going to come out as being somehow the most wonderful, most sensitive, most thoughtful person that we could ever have. That's not what the job is. The job is to get decisions right and to have impact in the world. And so my response to Raki, who asks us what is the CGI's comment on the COVID-19 crisis, it doesn't really matter. Has the CGI got most of their decisions right? And if our view is that he has, or the court has, then the court has served us well.
Beautifully expressed, and couldn't agree with you more. I would love to go on, but at this point, my question is to the host, Ravi. Ravi, how are we doing in terms of time? Do we have time, or do we stop at this stage with the customary thanks and send our responses through written responses to those who have been kind enough to ask these questions? Ravi, over to you.
Yeah. So, Mr. Dasgupta, the position is we are out of time, and I think most of the questions that were relevant in some sense between Professor Amita and Professor Sudhir has been answered. And I think where possible, I think they have also typed in some replies. So I think that this would be a proper time to bring this whole session to close. And I would like to thank Professor Amita Dhanda, Professor Sudhir Krishnaswamy, you, Mr. Dasgupta. I'd like to thank all of you all for doing this today, and to the attendees who have attended both in the room as well as those who are viewing us on YouTube. Thank you for sparing your evening today to listen to these speakers talk about issues around social equity and the marginalized in India. Thank you very much, and good night.
May I have the last word, please?
Sure, sir, sure.
I mean, on a light note, Yugandhar was a very good kamma, and like all good kammas, he enjoyed his scotch in the evening. Thank you very much.